Hi, everyone. The title of this webinar is COVID as an Adverse Childhood Experience, What School Counselors Can Do. And your presenters today are Sam Durding, Cara Dane, Vanessa Eaton, and Susie Haas. So thanks again for joining us. Today, we're going to share data regarding the impact of the pandemic, discuss the adversity of the COVID-19 experience on a holistic level, present our claim that the pandemic has served as a collective ACE for this generation of students, and share relevant research. Discuss what it means for us as their school counselors, both now and in the years to come, and share prevention and intervention strategies that we may use to combat the social, emotional, and academic effects of the pandemic at school. So note the following learning objectives for this webinar: to recognize the ways that the pandemic has affected students on multiple levels, social, emotional, mental health, and academic, understand the nature of adverse childhood experiences and how the effects of COVID align with this construct, and 3, to learn trauma-informed prevention and intervention strategies that may be used to respond to the adverse effects of the pandemic on students. So some materials that you need: just some paper and pencil, and your willingness to reflect. Our presentation today will align with the following 3 ASCA mindsets and behaviors. BPA 2, identify gaps in achievement, attendance, discipline, opportunity, and resources. BPF 6, demonstrate understanding of the impact of cultural, social, and environmental influences on student success and opportunities. And BSS 1, design and implement instruction aligned to ASCA mindsets and behaviors for student success in large group, classroom, small group, and individual settings. So we have a poll here. And here it is. And I was wondering if you could all take a couple moments to answer these questions. Does everyone see the poll?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay, let's see. I'm going to relaunch it. Do you all see it?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. It looks like we're still waiting on 2 responses and 1 more. Awesome. Okay. So ending the poll, this is how we answered. So the adverse health condition consequences of ACEs generally diminish by adulthood. 67% said true and 33%, one of us said false. So the answer to that one is false. The adverse health consequences of ACEs are shown by research to span the lifespan. Question number 2, the educational impacts of COVID-19 have been relatively equivalent across demographics. We see there how the breakdown between true and false was, and the answer to that is false. Students of color, LGBTQ students, English language learners, low SES students have been disparately affected by the educational impacts of COVID-19. And then, do you believe that COVID-19 should be considered an ACE? And this is, your own answer here right now. 67% said yes, and 33% said no. So this is the topic we're hoping to tackle today, and we'll see how it goes. All right. Next, I was wondering if you would join me in centering our thoughts with a short reflective activity. So reflecting on the past year and a half, take about 2 minutes and write down some words, phrases, and/or pictures that represent stories you've heard from students about their pandemic experience. We asked a group of high school students for their words, and this is what they shared. Thank you for participating. Okay, and now Vanessa will present on the data of the pandemic and the way it has affected students.
Great. Thank you, Susie. So now we're going to move on to our first objective of our presentation, which is to recognize ways that the pandemic has affected students on multiple levels: social, emotional, mental health, and academic. So in part one, we will describe the impact of COVID on schools throughout the US. I want to share with you a brief timeline to get a sense of the historical event of school closes in the US. So per edweek.org, the first cases of COVID began to appear on January 29, 2020. By this time, a small number of schools began to take precautions. By mid-February, teachers' unions began to grow alarmed and called for federal guidance on how to handle the coronavirus. Also, during that time, there were temporary school closures in Washington and New York. On February 25th, the CDC declared a warning to schools to prepare for school closures and distance learning. In Washington State, the North Shore district of 24,000 students moves to distance learning for up to 14 days. That was March 5th. Then on March 11th, 2020, the World Health Organization declares COVID-19 a pandemic. By March 25, that was the date when all the US public school buildings were closed. And now our next slide Oh yeah, sorry. The next slide. Thank you, Susie. Here's an alarming statistic from UNESCO. The number of students affected by COVID in the US is 77,678,500, and US schools were closed for 58 weeks. Here you can see a clearer picture of the total amount of students affected. Thank you, Susie. Now we're looking at part 2. So how did COVID impact students' wellness and academic achievement? First, we take a look at students' wellness. There was a decline in mental health and behavioral support services as students were not able or received less mental health and behavioral support because they were no longer at school sites. Students who already have adverse childhood experiences, including members of the LGBTQ+ community who may have experienced physical abuse and or sexual abuse, are at a higher risk because their homes were not a safe place. We also have basic needs going unmet. Minority groups, including individuals with low socioeconomic status and immigrant populations, continued to work as essential workers. However, students had to stay home for distance learning, unsupervised, therefore experiencing neglect. To put things in perspective, for the 2020 US Census, 16.2% of the US population 18 and under is living under poverty. This means it's about 53,168,400 children and youth may be greatly affected by the pandemic. Then we have children on the other end of the spectrum who may have financial resources for internet and digital devices. For these students, they may be at risk for sexual exploitation and cyberbullying. According to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD, COVID has amplified the use of digital tools and expanded digitalization. Children relied on the internet and digital devices for education purposes, for their social life, and also for relaxation. So one downside is the sheer amount of exposure to cyber domains, including sexual exploitation and cyberbullying. Another minority group affected is the Asian American students. This group has experienced a growing threat of harassment, including verbal abuse, shunning, and physical abuse. Asian American students may not feel safe attending in-person school due to the fear of possible violent attacks. And then on the next slide, we have how did COVID impact students' academic achievement? So per the Department of Education, special COVID-related reports, their number one observation finding was that the COVID pandemic has significantly affected academic growth in core subjects of math and reading, further widening the academic gap. Another group the Department of Education identified was the population of students learning English. The pandemic created a bigger challenge for these students trying to master level grade and also learning a new language. Additionally, students in marginalized populations, for example, low socioeconomic status, Black or Latinx, Hispanic students, may not have had the proper technological devices or the hardware required for distance learning. To get a sense of the big picture, back in October 2020, a survey conducted by the US Census Bureau showed approximately 1 in every 10 Black and Latinx households still lacked reliable computer access. And that was compared to the 6.7% of white households. So the COVID pandemic has affected people worldwide and has been felt particularly hard with certain populations, one being school-aged children. The current academic year marks the beginning of schools returning to in-person learning in many areas of the country. And school counselors are seeing firsthand the amount of additional academic and social-emotional support students need. Understanding COVID's impact on all populations will help school counselors identify additional challenges students are experiencing due to the pandemic. Moreover, counselors should pay particular attention to those students and minority groups, such as those living with a disability, English language learners, Black, Latinx, LGBTQ+ students, and students living in low-income households, Asian American students, foster youth, and homeless students, given the distinct effect COVID has had on members of these populations. And here we have Sam with our next section.
Thank you, Vanessa. So the second objective is really to understand what an ACE is, what are the nature and the effects of adverse childhood experiences, and also to examine the effects that we've seen due to COVID-19. So the original ACE study was conducted by the CDC and Kaiser Permanente from 1995 to 1997 in Southern California. And while the original data is not available to the public, as the data is still being collected, the findings and interpretations of what has been collected and other studies that have been conducted across the world has given us quite a good amount of data. Dr. Felitti and Dr. Anda originally studied the 10 original ACEs, seen here in the graphic, in the picture on the slide. And as you can see, these adverse childhood experiences were organized into three main categories: abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. There are some major findings with this original study. First, they found that roughly 61% of all adults had experienced at least one adverse childhood experience, and nearly 1 in 6 had 4 or more. They found that ACEs were linked to chronic health problems, such as heart disease, mental health illness, such as depression and anxiety, and substance abuse issues, such as alcoholism. They found that women and racial minority groups tend to be at a greater risk of experiencing more ACEs. And they found the ACEs had a connection to economic and social costs to families, communities, and societies. Next slide, please. In this study, researchers also developed the ACE pyramid. This is used to represent the study and how the ACEs are strongly related to neurodevelopmental disruptions, social, emotional, and cognitive impairments, and health and well-being risk factors as well. The CDC identified 5 behavioral risks: stagnation, smoking, alcoholism, drug use, and missed work. And they also identified 10 physical and mental risks: severe obesity, diabetes, depression, suicide attempts, STDs, heart disease, cancer, stroke, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and even broken bones. They found that all of these had a connection to adverse childhood experiences. And while this study was groundbreaking and continues to have lasting impacts on societies, further researchers have taken Dr. Felletti's and Dr. Anda's findings and have expanded them into even a more holistic view. Next slide. In 2017, the Building Community Resilience Collaborative developed what's called the Pair of ACEs, which demonstrates that experiences and environment can cause trauma. Through this illustration, the Building Community Resilience states that the tree depicts the interconnectedness of the environment or soil in which children's lives are rooted, and the experience or branches which children's bud and grow, is how they use this metaphor. They explain that the leaves represent exposure to adverse childhood experiences and might be easy to see, but soil that is steeped in systemic inequities and dysfunction robs an individual of necessary nutrients to support a thriving community. They argue that By improving the soil through things such as investments in economic development, affordable housing, or educational opportunities, the branches on the trees will grow stronger, yielding healthier leaves, which in turn will translate into quantifiable improved outcomes. And some of the examples they give as goals for those outcomes: increased kindergarten readiness, increased high school graduation rates, lower crime rates, and increased economic mobility for children and families. Next slide. As important as the original ACE study and subsequent studies have been, every research study has its advantages and its limitations. The study has been used in many different communities, kind of as a barometer test to develop community initiatives, and has helped advocate for many different community resources. To just give a quick example, within my own community, the effect of this study and further trauma-informed training has led to the development of what's called the Loft. This is a temporary shelter specifically designed for youth experiencing homelessness. And they have faculty on staff whose entire goal is to connect students, give them temporary shelter, and then connect them with safe, stable housing. That resource is a direct result of taking the original ACE study and translating it into my community. It has been used in intervention strategies and educational trainings throughout the world, and has helped educators understand the importance school plays on an individual's well-being. However, first and arguably most important of its limitations is its simplification of stating that these 10 experiences are what cause trauma. If there's any one thing we've learned from trauma-informed approaches, it's that perception is everything. And while an experience may not be designated as traditionally traumatic, it may still have a traumatic effect on the individual. Furthermore, in August 2020, Dr. Robert Anda, who was part of the original ACE study, along with others, stated concern that the ACE scores were being misappropriated as a screening or diagnostic tool, as opposed to its original intent. And the quote he said here is, the intent was a relatively crude measure of cumulative childhood stress exposure. And so people using this as a diagnostic tool instead of simply just a way to gauge exposure. Next slide. This brings us to part 2, our second objective of should COVID-19 be considered a new ACE. In their study on depression among young adults, Dr. Roy Perls and others found that the pandemic has really only increased anxiety, depression, sleep disruptions, and thoughts of suicides in students. So the question regarding COVID as an adverse childhood experience is, should COVID-19 be its own adverse childhood experience, or is it simply an amplifier of the symptoms of original ACEs? A cornerstone of trauma-informed therapy is phenomenology. As a client's perception of an experience is more important than the experience itself. In December 2020, Journal of Community Safety and Wellbeing, Michelle McManus and Emma Ball posed the question, how can COVID-19 be an ACE when the whole world has experienced it? And their responses discusses the importance of perception versus experiences. And they warned that the danger surrounding COVID-19 is that we may consider that everyone has been adversely affected in the same way. This assumes an equal playing field prior to the pandemic. In doing so, they warned that taking this assumption, basically, they warned that all children will simply bounce back from the impact of lockdown. Next slide. As previously stated, one of the biggest downfalls of ACEs is its simplification. So many factors such as frequency, severity, an individual's age and socioeconomic status all may play a role in the impact an individual experiences to an adverse childhood experience. The same is true for COVID. While we all experience lockdown in some way, the severity of that experience is very diverse. The ACEs study has helped bring trauma-informed trainings and practices into schools, healthcare services, criminal justice agencies, and many other organizations. Those invested in these trauma-informed trainings are most definitely talking about COVID-19 and the various experiences individuals had. But are these conversations about COVID-19 talking about it as a traumatic, individualized experience? We argue that adopting COVID-19 into the framework as an 11th ACE or as an experience or environment on the pair of ACEs tree would really only help to further instill the importance of not making assumptions about an individual, help bring about more trauma-informed experience, and it would allow those who have experienced COVID as a traumatic event to share their narrative. Thank you.
Okay, so now we're going to get into our third objective, which states that we will learn trauma-informed prevention and intervention strategies that may be used to respond to the adverse effects of the pandemic on students. To start, let's talk a little bit about trauma and what trauma-informed school practices are. So trauma can be defined as any adverse experience that affects a child's ability to function. Trauma can be toxic to the brain and can have a permanent impact on the neurological and cognitive development of a child. As we've just learned, COVID-19 has affected children in many different ways and can be considered an adverse childhood experience. Research has shown that because of the prevalence of ACEs and the harm they can cause children over their life course, trauma-informed school programs are necessary to mitigate the effects of adverse childhood experiences like COVID-19. The goal of a trauma-informed school program is to minimize children's ongoing exposure to adversity and unnecessary trauma triggers, while also strengthening supports and coping through individualized or more generalized approaches. Protective factors such as positive parenting and support from family members are helpful in the recovery and prevention of trauma. However, when adversity is coming from within the home, protective factors in the school setting become even more crucial for children. So when thinking about creating a trauma-informed school environment, what is needed? A central concept of a trauma-informed setting is that everyone who interacts with a student assumes that every child has trauma in his or her background and acts accordingly. There needs to be an understanding among educators of the symptoms of toxic stress and how these effects present themselves in a school setting. With these conditions in place, educators can work to create a kinder, gentler environment. A culture based on trust and acceptance can go a long way toward creating a positive learning environment that also can heal and transcend the effects of toxic stress. One of the key elements to an effective trauma-informed school is the total commitment on all levels of the school, in particular the school administration. It cannot be the responsibility of only the school counselors or school social workers. Staff training across disciplines, integrated trauma-sensitive routines, individual student supports, close collaboration with the behavioral healthcare community, well-crafted policies and procedures, and targeted outcome-focused funding will help schools establish environments that will enable all children to succeed. So now that we understand why trauma-informed school practices are important and what they should consist of, let's talk about specific prevention and intervention strategies that schools should adopt to mitigate the effects of COVID-19 on students. One particular study by Herrenkohl and colleagues compiled and critiqued school-based trauma-informed intervention strategies from 30 different peer-reviewed articles. Interventions were broken up by individual group-based interventions, classroom-based interventions, and then school-wide interventions. So individual group-based interventions are interventions that target one student at a time or a small group of students, and are administered by mental health clinicians or school professionals with training in cognitive behavioral therapy and trauma care. Common interventions that are used are trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, regular cognitive behavioral therapy, mindfulness strategies, psychoeducation, teaching coping and relaxation techniques, as well as parent education. Students that participated in these interventions showed a reduction in PTSD, anxiety, and depression symptoms, and an increase in resilience, emotional regulation, social and academic competence, classroom behavior, and discipline. Classroom-based interventions include programs that are delivered in classroom settings, often by teachers with specialized training. Interventions at this level include similar interventions as the individual group-based interventions, such as the psychoeducation and teaching the coping and relaxation strategies, but they also include skill building on emotion regulation, communication, problem solving, goal setting, and managing stress. These interventions showed an improvement in overall resilience, problem solving, and empathy for students. And then school-wide interventions are multi-component, multi-tiered interventions that include psychoeducation and teacher training. They are designed to span the entire school system and to provide outreach and education to parents and providers in the local community. Most of the interventions listed have a tiered system of supports, professional development for teachers on trauma-informed approaches, and psychoeducation for students and parents. Results have shown that incorporating school-wide trauma-informed interventions can reduce suspensions, discipline referrals, and PTSD symptoms, and they can also increase school readiness and academic performance among students. So next, we are going to share a short 5-minute guided meditation video that can be used by teachers to either start their day or start their class period, just to help students become more mindful and ready to learn. And Susie, make sure that your sound is on.
Find a comfortable position, either seated or lying down. Notice how your body is feeling. Is it feeling restless, tired, achy? Notice how your breath is feeling. Can you feel it move in and out of your nostrils? Maybe your mouth? Notice how your mind is feeling. Are there lots of thoughts running around? Does the mind feel pretty busy? Now feel every part of your body that is touching the floor or chair. Feel your body get heavier and heavier, like the ground is carrying you. Start to breathe more deeply. Breathe in. Feel your chest and belly fill like a balloon. Breathe out. Feel the balloon empty. Breathe in. Feel your chest and belly fill like a balloon. Breathe out. Feel the balloon empty. When you get nervous or anxious or worried, what happens in your body? Where do you feel it? When you feel nervous or anxious or worried, can you come back to your deep breathing when you feel this way? Now start to come back to feeling every part of your body that's touching the floor or chair. Feel your body get heavier and heavier, like the ground is carrying you. Notice how you're feeling now. Try to take this calm feeling with you through the rest of the day.
All right, so like I was saying, that is just an example of a classroom-based intervention that teachers could use to teach their students some relaxation techniques that will help them be more mindful and ready to learn. So now we're going to go back to Susie and she'll help wrap us up.
All right, thanks everyone. So let's go back to our poll feature. And here we have a quick exit poll. And so if you don't mind taking just a couple moments and answering these two questions. Okay, so that's awesome to see. Everyone is finished. And so here you guys can take a look at the results. I'm thrilled to see that you all gained value from this presentation. And, I'm sure that the question of, do you believe that COVID-19 should be considered an ACE, regardless of what any of us believes, it's going to be a pertinent question as we move through the world of education in the aftermath of COVID and for many years to come, I really believe. And let's see. And then I'd also like to ask if you all would mind reflecting on the presentation and doing a final reflective activity here. And you can write these things down on a piece of paper. If you're not watching this live, if you are watching this live, I would love it if you would go ahead and put your input here in the chat. And so the question is, what are 3 intentions, strategies, and/or statistics that you will bring back to your schools regarding ACEs and COVID in particular? I just wanted to look at some of the comments that are in the chat. I'm hoping that everyone can see it, but if not, I've seen a number of times, mindfulness, a focus on a trauma-informed approach universally for everyone, stress reduction and coping skills. These are things that we really need to be a part of our schools moving forward. If they weren't already, this is something to advocate for as school counselors for our students, regardless of what a student's experience with COVID was, whether they interpret it as trauma or not, or if they've internalized it as trauma or not. Everyone has gone through this, and there's no denying the adversity that COVID has presented, the need to adapt. And so, as we move forward with a trauma-informed approach in our schools, this is something that from a prevention as well as an intervention standpoint is going to be helpful to every single one of our students. Trainings for all staff, that can be tough. And I hope that we can bring back some inspiration to our faculty, our teachers, and our administrators to advocate for more trainings and a growth mindset amongst our school communities. A bigger non-judgmental approach, because students have experienced an enormous amount of trauma that may not manifest right away. That's such an excellent point that, trauma can present, the effects of that can present itself, in the future, years down the road. And, that what we know about ACEs is that those effects, the health effects, they can stay with an individual throughout adulthood. Trauma is not the experience, but the reaction, yes. And that can develop over time, and students can be re-traumatized as, we re-engage and whatever the future holds. That is a very salient point. The tree analogy was great. I also loved that visual. I totally agree. And I think practice mindfulness. Yes. The statistics. Yes. And just to say that this recording will be available to anyone who would like to use it or revisit, the slides to write down some of those statistics that you can bring back to school. Data is so influential in advocacy. A universal trauma-informed approach and getting buy-in from administration to incorporate trauma-informed school practices, 100%. Buy-in from administration as well as from teachers. And I hope that we've given you just a tiny bit of inspiration to move forward and advocate and help to be an agent of change in getting that buy-in. And here are our references. Thank you again so much for watching our presentation.